Can y'all hear me okay? Do I need to move the mic up, or is this good? It's good? Okay. I know y'all are hanging on every word I say, so I want to make sure you hear it. Well, my name is Zach Daly. For those of you that haven't met me yet, we're glad that you are able to attend this morning, Somerville Church of Christ. Before we get started, I just wanted to say quickly that we had our celebration of life for Kevin yesterday, and I had the privilege of teaching with Kevin last spring, and we didn't know at the time it was his last Bible class, but it was. And I didn't know Kevin as long as y'all, a lot of y'all. I knew him for about 5 years, and that was the only class I got to teach with him. But it was a privilege to teach with him. And I could tell, he strengthened me by his preparation and talking with him about the class. And I'm glad I got to have the opportunity to teach with him. So we're going to be continuing our series in Hebrews this morning. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 8. And if you remember, as we've been going through Hebrews, we've seen how the author continually shows how Jesus is superior to different things. Does anybody remember what we talked about in chapters 1 and 2? When Jesus was superior to what in those chapters? Angels, right. We talked about how angels were the messengers of God, but Jesus is God. And he came to us and did what angels could not do. And what we talked about in chapters 3 and 4, what he compared Jesus to. Or who did he compare Jesus to? Moses, right. Remember, Moses was the giver of the old law, the old covenant. He compared Jesus to Moses. And then these past couple of weeks, we've been comparing Jesus to the old order of priests. We've been comparing Jesus to Levitical priests. Remember Doug last week talking about how Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. He is a greater priest than those Levite priests. And he's going to continue some of that thought today in chapter 8. But then he's going to transition into comparing the old covenant, the old law, with the new covenant that Jesus brings us. So that's where we're going today. We're going to continue our thoughts on Jesus being our new high priest, and then we're going to transition into talking about the differences in the old and new covenant. Okay? So if y'all will, if you haven't already, flip to Hebrews chapter 8. Chris, can you read verses 1 through 6 for us, please?
Now the main point in what has been said is this: we have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle which the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. So it is necessary that this high priest also have something to offer. Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are those who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, just as Moses was warned by God when he was about to erect the tabernacle. For, see, he says, that you make all things by the pattern which was shown to you on the mountain. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, to the extent that he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises.
So in that first verse, the author is saying, here's kind of the main point of what we're saying. We have such a high priest. So what type of high priest is he talking about? Remember, he's continuing his thoughts from chapter 7, so we have to go back a little bit to last week. If you look in chapter 7, verses 26 through 28, he says, such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the people's, For this he did once for all when he offered up himself. So what kind of high priest is Jesus? What sort of high priest do we have? What descriptions does the author give us in those verses?
Ultimate.
Ultimate?
Yeah. He's none higher than you, or ever will.
None higher than Jesus?
Perfect.
Perfect. What else?
He's
Seated on the right hand of God.
Seated at the right hand of God.
He sacrificed himself.
Right? He sacrificed himself. And he talks about that a little later in the book. Anybody else? What jumps out at you from there?
Well, he was appointed by God himself. He was not just there because he was descended from Aaron. He was appointed by God personally.
Yeah, and it's, imagine what the Israelites, the Hebrew Christians who were hearing this, they were used to the human high priest, right? And so that's why the author is really drawing this contrast between what you were used to and what you have now. What you have now is so much greater than what you had before. And he's encouraging them to recognize that, right?
Zach,
Yes, ma'am.
I could be off base on this, but didn't the Old Testament priests stand when they were doing their offering? And this talks about Jesus being seated
Mhm.
at the right hand of God.
Yeah, a couple of the commentaries I looked at as I was preparing kind of talked about that. And they talked about how, in the temple, there wasn't a place for the priest to sit down because the priest was working. But Jesus, being seated, his work has been completed, right? He's no longer offering sacrifices. The sacrifice was offered, and it was a perfect sacrifice, and it was the last sacrifice that was needed. So yes, that's a good point.
And he was the minister of the true tabernacle, not one that man constructed.
Yeah, isn't that a cool image? He talks about how the tabernacle, or the temple as well, are a shadow of what's to come, right? And the temple of the first century that these Jews were used to, like that was an architectural feat at that time. Like it was an impressive building. And here he's saying that is just a pale imitation of the true temple that Jesus serves at. So you answered my next question, Ms. Lonnie. Where did Jesus minister? He ministered to the true temple, the true tabernacle. What sacrifice did Jesus offer?
His blood.
Yes.
Blood. What was the method of sacrifice for the old priests? You remember that?
Shedding of blood.
Yeah, shedding of animal blood, right? They had all these different rules about what types of animals they would offer for what sorts of sacrifices. They had all of these rules they had to know and follow. But Jesus offers his perfect blood as opposed to the animal's blood, right?
The former priests also had to first cleanse themselves before they could offer any sacrifices or offering service to anyone else, right? They first had, Jesus didn't have to do that either.
Right. Yeah, and that's really the difference. We're going to get into that a little bit more in some later chapters. The difference between Jesus, our true high priest, and the high priest of the Levitical order. Yeah, Jesus brought his own body, his own blood, right? There's kind of an interesting parallel, kind of between what Miss Lottie was saying with the temple being a pale imitation of the true temple. You can almost think of the animal sacrifices, the animal blood, being a pale imitation, right? A pale imitation of the true sacrifice that was yet to come. And that was Jesus's perfect life that he lived. So in verse 6, he says, not only is Jesus our high priest, but he is also the mediator for our new covenant, right? And so now we're moving into this discussion on old covenant and the new covenant that Jesus brings to us.
Can I,
Yeah.
before you get away from verse 5, and this is just something you might want to look into. It says that the copy and the shadow of the heavenly things. So before anything, I suggest this tabernacle is there. It was created before creation. It was made before creation. This is where Melchizedek was the priest. And the reason why I say that, you can't build something from something that doesn't exist. If you're going to copy it, it's got to be there, and then you copy it. You follow what I'm saying? Nothing casts a shadow. There has to be something to cast a shadow. I think what I'm suggesting that he might be saying here is that everything functions. You guys know me. I've always believed souls are eternal, no beginning, no end. What's their purpose? To worship God. That was their purpose before all creation, and this was the temple led by Melchizedek, where they worshipped God. Then when the problem came with Satan, and God creates what we call creation, now you have a reason to copy what is in heaven, to read something.
Thank you for that, Jack. Any other thoughts on that section before we move on? Yes, sir.
Moses was given very detailed specifications on how it was to be, how long, how wide, where every piece of furniture went. It had to be so detailed because it had to be the best copy they could make. Technology in those days.
Yeah. Anybody else? All right, well, let's move on. Now we're going to start talking about how Jesus is the mediator for this new covenant that he brought with the shedding of his blood. So will somebody read verses 7 through 13 for me, please?
Or if there, go ahead. Or if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear."
Thank you. So what is this covenant that the author's referring to? The first covenant that he talks about in verse 7.
The old law.
The old law, right. And when was that handed down? Like what was the process of the old law being given?
To Moses on Mount Sinai.
Right. So you remember Israel, the nation of Israel was brought out from Egypt, brought out from slavery and bondage, and God made this covenant with them. He said, "I will be your God and you will be my people if you keep this covenant." And he lays out the covenant, covenant is, what the nation of Israel is going to do, what God's going to do. And so he lays that out for them and creates this relationship between them. So what was the purpose of the covenant?
To make it so that God could dwell with his people.
To make it so that God could dwell with his people, right? He was setting them aside, right, as a special nation, a chosen nation. And that was signified through this covenant, through the agreement that they have with God.
It was also to make them understand what he expected.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about a section in Romans in a little bit. It deals with the Old Covenant. But yeah, it was to help Israel understand who God is, right? Help Israel understand what was expected of them, help them to understand what sin was, what things were acceptable and what things weren't. So, the author seems to say that there was something not quite right with this first covenant, right? Because he says if the first covenant had been perfect, if there was nothing wrong with the first covenant, we wouldn't need a second covenant. So what was wrong with the first one?
People.
People. What do you mean by people?
The people that were on the other side of the covenant didn't keep it.
The people that were on the other side of the covenant didn't keep it. Are there some examples of them not keeping it that you can think of?
The Old Testament.
Maybe a few. The whole Old Testament. Somebody give me a couple of specific examples.
Well, the golden calf right away.
Yeah. While Moses is up on the mountain getting the covenant, and they're building an idol, right?
Idol worship.
Sorry, what was that?
Idol worship.
Idol worship. Yeah, that was a consistent theme throughout the history of Israel, right? They were turning away from God. So if you'll flip over to Romans, we're going to look at chapter 8, verse 3 real quick, and then we'll have a longer section we'll look at in a little bit. But if you're interested in this idea of the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant, Romans chapter 7 and 8 are a good resource for you to look at. So Romans 8:3 says, "For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin. He condemned sin in the flesh." So just like y'all said, right, the flaw in the Old Covenant was that it relied too much on us. We weren't able to keep our part of the bargain. And so you see throughout the Old Testament, this Old Covenant being broken and the people being punished. But
And I want to be clear that the old covenant worked. It was never meant to be anything but temporary. God never intended for it to be the permanent covenant. Therefore, it didn't have to be perfect. It had to do what it needed to do at that time because it was all dependent on the sacrifice that was coming in Jesus Christ. And so it was never intended. It's not like God made a mistake and created it to be perfect. He created it to do what it needed to do for that time. But it was always intended to point to Jesus as the permanent covenant.
yeah, absolutely. It's like a foreshadowing of the coming new covenant, right? And God talks about that new covenant in this excerpt from Jeremiah that the author quotes right here. And that's in verses 8 through 12. So what are the characteristics of this new covenant that the author, or that God talks about in this excerpt from Jeremiah? What are some of the characteristics of the new covenant that you see in those verses? Verse 8 through 12. The first one that jumps out at me, God says, "I will," right? Verse 8 says, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant. God's providing the action, right? It's not dependent on our works to fulfill this covenant. God is providing the action. God is providing the sacrifice through Jesus for us. What else do you see?
Zach,
Yes, ma'am.
is there any significance in that verse 8 that he lists both the house of Israel and the house of Judah?
I'm sure there is, but I'm not aware. Does anybody have any knowledge on that?
And then he flips in verse 10 to just the house.
Does anybody have any knowledge on that? Talking about why does he refer
In
to?
Isaiah, the kingdom was divided, so
Okay.
that would be why he would mention both.
And I'm wondering too, if it comes down to the part where we read as Christians that God does not want anyone
Yes.
to miss the kingdom.
And what else do you see described about this new covenant in those verses?
That his people have his laws in their hearts and minds.
Absolutely. Where was the old covenant written?
Scrolls.
It was written on tablets of stone and then on scrolls, right? But this new covenant, this new law, is going to be written on his people's hearts and minds.
Which is where he wanted his law written
Yeah.
to begin with.
Yeah.
That's not a new concept.
Right.
Right.
Obviously.
Yeah, I don't know the reference, but I know there's a verse that says, scribe it on your children's heart and talk about it while you're walking and
Yep.
eating and all that stuff.
Deuteronomy 5.
Deuteronomy 5.
This
Yeah,
one
that's a cool verse. Where in verse 11, where it says, "None of them shall teach his neighbor, and none his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all will know me, from the least to the greatest." We're not going to rely on an imperfect human mediator anymore, right? Under the old covenant, it had to rely on the priest, the high priest, to make those sacrifices to God. We don't have to rely on that anymore. Now we have the perfect high priest, who is also God. We have that relationship with him.
This is, the new one is not limited to one nation, it's to everybody and it's individual.
So it's not limited to just one nation, it's for everybody.
Exactly.
Yes, sir.
When you told us to read verse 9 in Hebrews, I was still lost over in Romans.
Yeah.
I was reading verse 9, but it gave a great answer for that too, because it says, "You, however, are not controlled by the sinful nature, but by the Spirit, if the Spirit of God lives you, inside of you." So the Spirit of God living inside of us, and it talks about that we have the Spirit.
Absolutely. All right, there was a couple more things I saw in here that jumped out at me. Y'all see anything else in this description of the new covenant and how it differs from the old covenant? I'm looking at verse 12. The old covenant it had a lot of punishments in it, right? There was a lot of punishment for sins. And God displayed mercy in the old covenant, but there was a lot of punishment as well. This new covenant is really characterized by God's mercy, right? God's mercy in sending his son for us to die.
That's a good point. The old law, which was perfect, was about convicting. Paul said, "I'd have never known sin if it wasn't for the old law to tell me what it was. I'd have never known what covenant was if the old law hadn't told me." So the old law was more about convicting. The new law is about forgiveness.
Yeah, you jumped right where I was going to go, Jack. So that's,
So I read your notes.
yeah. If you're interested, I'll read this to you, but if you want to follow along, flip over to Romans chapter 7, verse 7. And like I said, this Romans 7 and 8, Paul really tackles this question of the old covenant versus the new covenant. What was the purpose of the old covenant? What's the purpose of the new covenant? So in Romans 7 verse 7, I'm going to read. I'll read until I think it's a good place to stop. How about that? Paul says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, 'You shall not covet.'" So that was what Jack was saying, right? The old covenant convicted. The old covenant illuminated what sin was for the people. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead. I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment, which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. Therefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just, and good. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. What I am doing I do not understand, but what I will to do, that I do not practice, but what I hate that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good I will to do I do not do, but the evil I will not to do that I practice. Now if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. If I find then a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good, for I delight in the law of God, according to the inward man. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. So we see Paul in here really wrestling with this idea that we've kind of been talking about, right? That the old covenant is good, but we're unable to follow it perfectly. We're unable to follow it completely. And because of that, it does not do what it was intended to do for us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You gotta read 8:1 though. Therefore there is now no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. That's the difference between the old law and the new law. The old law condemned us in our sin, and it gave away to holiness, but it required our continued obedience to that law, and so we were trapped in that. The new law, there is no condemnation. We've been set free from that sin. That's the difference right there.
Absolutely.
So also in Hebrews, verse 12, not only does he forgive us, but he forgets it. It's not like when you get mad at your spouse and you bring something up from 2 months ago. God's forgotten it. It's done.
Yeah, it's a perfect and complete forgiveness of sins, right? Under the old covenant, it wasn't just one sacrifice they had to make, right? They were making sacrifices all the time because the sacrifices were imperfect, and that forgiveness had to keep offering sacrifices to get that forgiveness. Here we have the perfect sacrifice, the perfect forgiveness through Jesus.
I'm amazed you said 2 months ago. My wife could recall already.
Yeah, I might be happy with only 2 months of recall. I might take that part. Doug?
Well, the old sacrifice, yeah. The old covenant was more about what you needed to do in order to be right with God. Here's the list of things you need to do. And it just led the people, let them know they can't do it. They can't do all these things all the time. So if they mess up once, then they're a sinner. And, but the old covenant is what you need to do to be saved. The new covenant is it's already been done. Jesus did it for us on the cross.
Yes, sir.
If you watch different movies, different video games, things like that, you get dropped into a new world that you don't know anything about. Somewhere around, you may be able to find a survivor guide. To an extent, if you look at it, the Old Testament was a survivor's guide to get us to the point where we were able to have the ultimate sacrifice. If for whatever reason you weren't intelligent enough, you weren't obedient enough, you weren't whatever enough to understand, to recognize the plain, blatant signs in front of their faces, then obviously you weren't one of the survivors. If for whatever reason that you were able to pay attention, do not do this or this will happen. Do not do that or that will happen. If you're able to survive, to be able to get to the point where now, here's the ultimate sacrifice. All that I ask of you is believe in me. Trust that I'm there for you. Have trust in me. Just ask. I'll be there. That's the only thing you have to do. You made it to this point. That's the only thing you have to do.
Yeah, there is a sense in like the old covenant was more of a covenant of works, right? And this new covenant is a covenant of grace. We know from the New Testament that you can't be saved by your works alone. The only way you can be saved is by God's grace. So by establishing this new covenant, the author says that in verse 13 that the first covenant, the old covenant, has been rendered obsolete. And what is obsolete is getting ready to vanish. And these readers of this letter may have seen that actually happen. You know, this is a little bit of a foreshadowing to the destruction of the temple. Because if the temple's destroyed and there's nowhere to offer your sacrifices, that old covenant doesn't really work anymore. So, how do you think the Christian Jews, the Hebrew Christians who are the target audience of this letter, how do you think they heard this message about the old covenant being gone, being obsolete, and the new covenant coming? How do you think that made them feel?
Lost.
What was that?
Lost.
Lost. Why would it make them feel lost?
Well, because that's what they've been doing. I mean, and they've been earning their keep, so to speak. And all that they had lived by and trusted is nullified, basically.
Absolutely.
It's a whole new mindset.
So this old covenant, this old law, provided them the rhythm of life, right? The festivals, sacrifices, all of those things that they did in community with the other Israelites, the other Jews. All of a sudden, the author is saying that is gone, that has passed away. And that would, what if somebody came to you and said, let's just do a hypothetical. You don't have to do church anymore. You don't go to church anymore. How would that make you feel?
Awkward.
Awkward.
You've lived by something all your life that you always thought was almost, if not mandatory.
Yeah.
And now I'm hearing I don't have to do that. That would make you struggle inside too.
Yeah.
You want to make that change, but you're going to struggle with it to do it.
Right?
I think it would give us some hope also, because it had happened before. They were taken away to Babylon, they didn't have access to the temple when they were in Babylon. So we've been through this once before already. So it's like, okay, you don't have to worry about that anymore. This is different. You're regardless of wherever you're taken from now on, I'm with you.
That's a good point. Chris?
So Church of Christ people were there, and they said, well, we're not sacrificing lamb, we're going to eat it now. So everybody's doing it, right?
Yeah. I mean, think about if suddenly we no longer had to come to church. I mean, you know, we come to church for 2 hours on Sunday morning. Some of us are in home groups, life groups, Bible studies, that sort of thing. A lot of our friends, a lot of our relationships are formed through church. If you remove all of that, all of a sudden, I can see how you might feel a little lost or a little uncomfortable. Becky?
I think it was Ben Shapiro, and he's Jewish, who said, people ask, why do we have over 600 commandments that we keep all the time? And he said the purpose of that is to keep God in front of us all the time. So to them, it is a physical, I can see this, I can do this, and now all of a sudden they're being said, nope, it's just got to be in your heart, and you're going to believe this, without all of those signs that you saw.
That's a good point. Jack?
Zach, we did experience that. It just occurred to me, you know, back in, it was 2021, when we were told, hey, you gotta stay home because you got COVID.
Yeah.
How many of us didn't like that? You know, it just didn't feel good. You know?
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, the lockdowns are an example of that. So just like the Christian Jews, the Israelite Christians realize that they can't go back, right? And that's kind of a big theme throughout this book of Hebrews. You can't go back to your old way of doing things. A new way has come. When we put on Christ, we also have to recognize that we can't go back to our old life. We can't go back to our old ways. There's no salvation for us there. There's no hope for us there. And that's something that you have to recognize can be difficult for people who are new to Christ, who may be coming to Christ later in life. They're losing a lot of the community, a lot of the patterns and routines of life that they were used to. They're having to replace it with something else. Replace it with Christ. And that can be a difficult transition to make, and that's part of the role of the church, right? To help make that transition easier for them.
And one thing about it is, it's not just that you're leaving this old behind. There's a reason. The new one is better.
Yeah.
And we have to keep sight of that. And we've all been through several of those instances in our life. You know, when you're 5 years old and it's time to go to school the next day. You know, that's completely new. It's completely unsettling. You know, when you're going from middle school to high school, completely new. The night before your wedding, what am I getting into? I'm going to be married and living with somebody tomorrow. And it's better, but it's so new that you have to understand that it's you know, we've done this, but we still lose sight of the fact that, you know, yeah, I have to give this up, but I'm giving it up for a reason that it's going to be better. And we've got to have that explained to us more than once, quite often.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point, Chris. The new covenant is better than the old covenant, unquestionably. And that's something that the author makes sure to point out.
I think it would have been harder for the Jews than the Gentiles in some ways, because the Jews they've been earning.
Yeah.
They viewed themselves as earning. And now, basically, their efforts are of no value. They aren't going to get you anywhere. And that would be difficult, once again, total change of mindset.
Doug?
This is a total dilemma for modern day Jews, because they're still living under the old covenant. And the temple's gone. They fabricated a lot of the furniture that they're going to put in the temple when it's rebuilt, but it's not built yet. They essentially have no way to have their sins forgiven. And they know that.
All right, well, in the few minutes we have left, I want to go through and kind of compare and contrast the old and the new covenant. Okay, so I'm going to put up some things. I'll run through them relatively quickly, and then if we have time at the end, we can stop and anybody, whatever pops out at you, we can talk about. So they were instituted at different places, right? The first one was given on Mount Sinai. The second one was given at Mount Zion. They were spoken in different ways. The old one, you remember when Moses went up on the mountain to receive the old covenant, the people at the base of the mountain were afraid because of all the loud thunder. They could, it was just freaking them out. They received it with fear, right? And the new one Jesus brings to us, he declares it with love and grace, right? He takes it to the least of these. Different mediators. We've talked about this. The old covenant, Moses was the mediator. This went between the people, the nation of Israel and God. And in the new covenant, Jesus is our mediator. They're different in subject matter, right? We've talked about that today as well. The old was more of a covenant of works. The old was to convict them of their sins. The new one fulfilled the covenant of works, right? Fulfilled it through Jesus' life and his sacrifice. Their method of dedication. In the old covenant, the people were sprinkled with the blood of the animal, right? In the new covenant, we are baptized, symbolically taking part in Jesus' death, and we partake in the Lord's Supper, where we receive his blood.
But you're still sprinkled with his blood. In Hebrews 10:19, will tell you.
Yeah, we'll get to that next week. I think next week, maybe 2 weeks. Priesthood, we talked about that past couple of weeks. The old covenant priesthood of Levi, the new one, a new priest in the order of Melchizedek, talking about Jesus. Different in their practical effect on living, right? I must have skipped that one in my notes. Different in substance. There it is. So different in their practical effect on living. The old, they were in bondage to sin, right? We talked about that in Romans chapter 7. And the new, we have liberty through Christ. In their substance, the old was the shadow of things to come, right? A pale imitation. And the new one is the perfect culmination of that promise through Christ. And then lastly, duration. Old, like Lynn mentioned earlier, wasn't meant to last forever, to prepare the way for Jesus. But this new covenant lasts forever. Jesus made the perfect sacrifice once for all. So those are some that I pulled out. If there's any of those that you want to remark on, or if there's any that I didn't think of that you see, we have a few minutes to discuss that. So any of these jump out at you?
Well, we're told in Scripture that we are also a priesthood, a chosen priesthood.
Absolutely. All right, well, if there's no thoughts, I hope this lesson was an encouragement to you, gave you something to think about. Next week, Doug will take us on to chapter 9. All right, thank you all for your attention and participation. We'll see you next week.